Today is the 4-year anniversary of the January 6, 2021 Capitol Hill riot. It was not an insurrection. It was a riot. More on that later. To contrast this and to sort of explain why it was a riot and not an insurrection, we're going to go back to 2020, the year before the J6 riot. In 2020, there were massive protests across the country over the death of George Floyd. They were Black Lives Matter protests, but it was happening everywhere. Senator Tom Cotton, a Republican senator, said that Donald Trump at the time should invoke the Insurrection Act and allow the military to put these people down. Let's watch a news clip from back then and Tom Cotton saying these things about what he thinks Trump should do during these riots.
Law enforcement is...
Whoops. There we go.
But the rioting, the anarchy, and the looting ends tonight. If local law enforcement is overwhelmed, if local politicians will not do their most basic job to protect our citizens, let's see how these anarchists respond when the 101st Airborne is on the other side of the street.
And you're a guy from the infantry. You know what an organized opposition is, and this seems to be an organized opposition. And lastly, real quick, the President of the United States is weighing his options to address the nation. Should he, and what should he say?
I believe the President's remarks in Florida at the space launch were very appropriate. He said how horrified he was by the video that we all saw of George Floyd's death, and that we respected the rights of protesters, but there's no place in this country. We should have zero tolerance for anarchy and rioting and looting. And if necessary, the President should use the Insurrection Act to deploy active duty military forces to these cities to support our local law enforcement and ensure that this violence ends tonight, not one more night.
So why was it important to Tom Cotton to call the George Floyd riots an insurrection, to invoke the Insurrection Act? Because by calling something an insurrection and not just a riot, it puts it in a whole different other category. It means that politicians can justify treating American citizens differently if there's an insurrection as opposed to a riot. It means they can justify abusing their rights because it's different. It's an insurrection, not a riot. Now, when Tom Cotton was saying these things and the violence and chaos was happening from these protests in 2020, polls showed that half of Americans agreed with Tom Cotton and would gladly let Trump invoke this Insurrection Act and send the military to our streets. Thankfully, President Trump, to his credit, did not do that. We had riots. They were bad. It was a bad time in the country, but it was never called an insurrection. The military wasn't deployed. Fast forward a year to January 6, 2021. This is the 4-year anniversary today. You had a Capitol Hill riot. Democrats need, just like Tom Cotton wanted the George Floyd riots to be an insurrection, Democrats need J6 to be an insurrection for the same reason. Now, did the protesters on January 6th threaten to overturn the Electoral College? Yes, they did. Was there ever any real organized chance of that actually happening? Nobody who's looking at this clear-headed and being rational and being reasonable would say yes, there was a real chance that the U.S. government was going to be overthrown. Similarly, George Floyd protesters threatened local police departments. They threatened local governments. They did lots of damage. Tom Cotton wanted to call that an insurrection. But was there any real chance that these protesters during the George Floyd riots, these Black Lives Matter protesters, were going to overthrow the local or state government, or much less the national government? Nobody looking at this clear-eyed, reasonably and rational would say that they were going to overthrow the government. Putting it in a different category, the Capitol Hill riot, and calling it an insurrection, just like the George Floyd riots, calling it an insurrection, would allow politicians to abuse American citizens in their rights that's different than if it wasn't an insurrection. And voila, we have many J6 protesters in jail right now for sentences far longer than should have been, and hopefully that's rectified. But what we saw in 2020 was angry men and women, many of color, who were definitely not going to overthrow the government during the BML riots of 2020. And how else do I put this? The bait and tackle department at Walmart, who were running wild through the Capitol on January 6, 2021, were not going to overthrow the government, no matter how much Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and Liz Cheney want to pretend that. But, you know, that myth that J6 was an insurrection, it's now part of the Democrats' mythology. It's part of the left's religion. It's a grandiose lie, but it's one that they're going to believe every day and for the rest of their lives.
Our temple of democracy was attacked by insurrectionists.
The president should use the Insurrection Act